On today's World Insight, international cooperation is getting derailed by the pandemic. Can business leaders keep the world economy on track?
I don't see people leaving China. I see people that are operating in China going bankrupt at home.
And public health infrastructure is buckling under the weight of the pandemic. How can international lenders like the AIIB help?
To support healthcare infrastructure, public health infrastructure in Beijing and Chongqing.
And finally, overseas Chinese bear the brunt of the coronavirus-fueled racism. We hear from a Chinese Australian on how to combat this divisive rhetoric.
There are other people who also experience these things, and we're standing up and we're standing by them.
Here's our host, Tian.
Hello, I'm Tian, and welcome to World Insight. The coronavirus outbreak has left businesses around the world counting the costs. Global shares took a hit. Jobless claims surged, and many advanced economies are expected to enter recession. Earlier this month, the World Trade Organization predicted a severe decline in international commerce this year. How has the pandemic brought about economic uncertainties? Earlier, I talked with Joerg Wuttke, president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. He shared how the pandemic impacts China-EU trade. Now, of course, it's not necessarily politicians or business leaders or others that are driving the agenda, but rather the virus, right? Before a vaccine comes into being, what kind of efforts do you think, as a business leader leading European business in China, should make and should commit?
I guess that for us, it is really hanging in day by day. I think the big plans are not going to happen. I think we all try to see how we survive next month. At the same time, like take my own company, we have a huge project in Guangdong. We're determined to invest and keep going. I think sometimes it's much easier for large projects to be implemented now, because you look 10 years, 20 years. I think for me now the next 10 weeks is far more difficult than an investment decision for 10 years. 10 years is easy because you look at the base foundation. 10 weeks is very hard because events could change everything.
How would you persuade your headquarters to do that? I mean, yours would be just one of those many case studies, I would assume.
Yes. Well, I think I mean, I'm working for a German company which is very large in China. Luckily, all the decision makers have lived in China. That makes a hell of a difference. Explaining China, the trust that the team knows what they're saying, and having a realistic picture, not sort of sugarcoating the problems we face here, helps you to make a decision. I think I'm really worried about companies sort of trying to shed weight and pulling out of China. Now I think the fact that China started up again, whereas Europe has been shutting down, maybe drives the argument, you have to be in two markets at the same time. So maybe we can draw the conclusion there. But again, markets are as they are, and how many companies are going to go bankrupt? What is the demand story in Europe? That is more my worry. I don't see people leaving China. I see people that are operating in China going bankrupt at home.
But why? There seems to be, at least in the media coverage that I've been reading about, very strong suggestion that companies, European companies, are leaving China. Who are giving out information like that? It sometimes puzzles me, because when I talk to you face to face, you're telling me a totally different picture. But in certain narrative, that seems to be the ultimate truth. So which one?
I guess that AmCham, as well as the European Chamber, has made it very clear with the surveys that normally around about 10% of companies are leaving the country for various reasons. Either the market is gone, or competition is too tough here, or the constraints, they can't take it any longer and go home.
That's the normal situation, right?
10% is normal. Then you ask in the survey how many more of you will come in, it's also 10%. So it levels it out in a way. I can clearly see that companies that are associated with countries close to China, geographic-wise close, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, other places, that actually they are moving out because for them it's just a shipping route of 2 days or 1 day. For us as Europeans to move back to Europe means shipping of 6 weeks. And huge logistic costs. So I would say yes, the Japanese companies might be leaving. Some of them, some Europeans that are their sub-suppliers might leave equally with those guys, but the big picture among the Europeans is 10% is a normal data.
Europe always believed itself being caught in between China and America. At least it believes so. So what does that mean? Some suggest that this specific COVID-19 is going to drive the two economies further apart. Others do not agree. So at this point, how do the European businesses read the tea leaves in the cup? Well, certainly there's a storm already going on in the teacup.
Most people in China don't realize that in many ways we have a trade war with the United States. You know, everyone just looks at all these agriculture and all these tariffs. You know, we face huge tariffs on a couple of things from Scotland and France and other places. Europe is not caught in between with an option to choose. We don't want to choose. We want to be doing business, non-politicized with both parties.
How is this COVID-19 likely to change the mentality of doing business? That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I mean, remember, right after 9/11, there were a lot of debates about that the world will never be the same again. And remember, that was the thing that everybody's been talking about. Now, in retrospect, has that really bring that much change? I'm not sure. I want to get your opinion. And meanwhile, we're facing COVID-19 still going on. How is this likely to change our understanding of nature of business?
Well, I guess 9/11 has not only changed the way we travel, but also the way we deal with problems. It has polarized, it has sucked the energy out of the major power in the United States by being engaged in these wars. And I think that already in itself was a smaller incident. So the shutdown of the global economy, the kind of imposition of quarantines for most people in the globe is unprecedented, and I think my Chancellor Angela Merkel was right by saying this is the most serious situation that we have after World War II. To me, the big worry is unemployment, poverty. Young people that are 18, 35, male, possibly not married, this is normally the group that is willing to be terrorists and aggressive. And in my own history, every time we had a major crisis like this in Germany, we had an autocratic system coming up, which was throwing us back for decades. I think that kind of poverty threat is going to be the major task for us to resolve.
From business perspective, particularly European business in China, how do you look at the so-called international cooperation at this point?
I guess international cooperation is going to continue. I think we should not underestimate how interwoven our economies are. It's going to be very difficult and very costly to untangle this. So I guess that companies will realize also that the consumer doesn't want us to disconnect, because it would mean higher prices. And at a time when you have higher unemployment, lower economic growth, the last thing is you want higher prices. So I guess we have to not panic too much about that kind of dislocation of locations and so forth. In a time when, you know, the crisis is rising, to disconnect and not travel and not live in another country and not study in another country, I think that's a major threat. And we cannot overcome this with Zoom or Microsoft Teams and other areas. I'm worried about the soft factor there. Because that is something that is going to soft. It eventually comes into hard political decision making, and then that normally leads to nationalism and stress in the system, I would say.
COVID-19 is widely considered as one of the most significant challenges for all nations since the end of World War II. According to IMF, the global economy is expected to shrink by 3% this year. International cooperation has been found wanting under these trying circumstances. So how will business leadership step up? Let's listen in to my conversation with Joerg Wuttke. We are having so many things all at the same time, right? We have an unprecedented epidemic and pandemic, probably only comparable to 1918, as some say, the Great Influenza. And we also have a once every 4-year U.S. general election, which usually means politics will be leading the role for that country and therefore having its impact to the rest of the world. And meanwhile, we also have a possibility of competition among some of the largest economies in terms of their global impact. And this has never happened since the Second World War. So when you have one layer on top of the other, what is it like to be a business leader?
We have to deal with huge competition, more transparency in markets where decision-making is so fast. The fact is that social media is also looking after us is a real problem. I guess that we all thought the internet is going to be the salvation and solution of everything. Turns out to be it's an anger accelerator. It hypes people up. The opinions I get on my social media are shocking. Just posting something which might not even be my opinion just to make people think draws hatred to this. It seems like this social distancing, meaning I sit at the computer, someone does not have to criticize me in the face, means that they could be more hateful in the responsiveness. I think we're living in a more hateful society. As a business leader, you want to cooperate, you want to reach out, you have stakeholders, you want to talk to customers, you want all of this, and this is alien to us, this kind of. We love competition, but we don't like this kind of anger that is generated by social media. You know, you want to be good, but can you really afford to be good? Is of course a question many of us have. You have to realize that times you have labor camps that provide works in some parts of the world, and then all of a sudden you do this. Then you have to have better environmental compliance programs. You have to have social compliance programs. Everything costs money, but I think for the fiber of society, it's absolutely vital that companies don't cut corners.
Earlier, Mr. Wuttke, we talk about business leaders. If you look at people like Bill Gates, who of course, more than a business leader, more philanthropy globally, has been the target of accusations, but at the same time has also been praised and respected by enormous amount of people in the world. So what do you make of the role of leadership these days, particularly business leadership?
A man as rich as he is, as influential as he is, if you look into his real impact in the political landscape, it's actually shockingly low. I mean, I wish it would be better. The man has been talking about pandemics 5 years ago and says this is the biggest threat that the world's facing. We are not prepared. I mean, just imagine you would be a political leader that actually can sit there and actually prepare a country for it. So in a way, it's again to my point that multinationals or big companies are not, unfortunately, not as influential as many people guess it would be.
So you're saying people like Bill Gates being bashed by some in the world actually deter you and others as business leaders not to involve furthermore in the real debate. Is that what you're trying to suggest?
No, I guess that it's a very steep mountain, and we don't stop trying to get to the top, but it's very difficult, and we have to be aware that there are lots of stones falling on our head all the time. No, I think we should strive, clearly. Business leaders like him teach us that language matters, that setting the stage is important. That's what politics is all about. It's repetition, it is connecting with people, and I think many business leaders think like, oh, that's politics, I'm not engaged. But they live in the real world as politics is. So actually I think Bill is a wonderful example, like also Jack Ma and others, yes, in order to reach out and show that money doesn't matter, it's attitude and care. And you never hear anything hateful from him. And he does good things, but again, you have to be humble about what he can achieve. But even though it is very little, if it is little, it doesn't matter. We should still strive in order to make a difference.
What about your relationship as the head of the EU Chamber with the Chinese government? How are you representing the interests of your businesses here in China to the Chinese side?
Well, I think first and foremost it has to be fact-based, really. I mean, the Chamber goes the extra mile in order to find out what is the regulatory environment, where do our companies have a problem, what kind of recommendations we have. And then you have to have, frankly, the guts to speak up. Many people assume that what I say when I criticize issues, that this is not very friendly and so forth. But I guess I would be even more unfriendly if I would not say this, because I believe in the ability of China to get better. I believe in China as something that actually can move forward. I'm the child of the 90s here. You know, China had incredible steps forward, very complicated situations. So in a way, I never lost the feeling is China can do better. So this kind of, oh, you should not criticize, you should not say this, is to me, you will let China down because you think it's perfect already. And that's the worst that can happen to it. So in a way, the European Chamber has to have something where they generate the facts, and the facts have to be straight. How you then spin it, of course, you have to make it dependent on how willing your audience, meaning the government, is listen to you. I always felt like in bigger audience, of course, I try to be polite, but in a smaller setting, I can be very straight. And candid. I always appreciate it when I have interlocutors that are equally straight.
And do you think the European companies are also speaking up toward, let's just say, Washington?
They are reluctant, depending on who is your contractual partner sometimes. I think if you're a big infrastructure, you better be careful about who you offend.
Do you worry about this double standard?
I guess if you're in consumer items, if you're in chemicals, you're possibly more willing to speak up because you have so many different customers, not just one or two. So in a way, it really depends. But I think that the willingness to speak up towards the US is still higher than speaking up towards China.
What are you looking at for the next few months to go?
It depends on how do we maintain an equilibrium of having an economy which sort of is functioning, and we have the social distancing that comes with this. And again, the moral fiber of having human engagement. We can't turn into isolated zombies. That's not the purpose of life. So what kind of risk are we willing to take, for example, is something we have to ask ourselves. And how do we protect the vulnerable, the older people and the kids? I think, frankly, we should be humble about how little we know, and we should be courageous of where we want to go.